What is meant by sinking into unconsciousness when the man's consciousness is passing inwards from one sheath to another, either when leaving the physical body, or when passing from the astral world into the devachanic? The ego must ever be conscious on some plane or other, must it not? Bertram Keightley's response to this question, published in the Vahan in 1902. This question raises several points of considerable importance about which our knowledge is far from being either as accurate or as detailed as could be wished. Moreover, it must be borne in mind throughout the whole of what follows, that all our information is and must be conveyed in terms of the consciousness as functioning through the physical brain in waking experience, and not only must it be conveyed to us in such terms by those who can observe and investigate the facts upon other planes of being, but these observers themselves must in each case translate or bring through into their own waking consciousness in the brain the results of their observations and investigations upon other planes, and thus obviously import into them whatever limitations they themselves may be subject to when functioning in the physical body, in addition to the difficulties inherent in language itself when used to convey such results to other brains not acquainted at first hand with the experiences attempted to be described. Having thus set forth a most necessary caution, and one the more needed as we are about to engage in the rather hazardous task of drawing inferences and reasoning from the statements made by such observers, let us try and summarize the information at our disposal. First, then, what have we been told about the consciousness of the ego itself on its own plane? As it has been described to us, it is abundantly clear that the ego, not merely at the outset of its evolution in the human kingdom, but throughout a very large part indeed of that evolution, cannot be regarded as self-conscious on its own plane, and still less as having any consciousness of the Arupa thought world as an objective world. From what has been said, it would seem that the ego, throughout this long stage, is rather a source of consciousness, a center containing all consciousness potentially, but actually responding only to a very limited range of vibrations indeed, and quite without anything like self-consciousness or even consciousness at all on its own plane, excepting when the flash of consciousness occurs in it, at the termination of the devachanic period following each earth life, when, for a moment, it has been stated, the ego is conscious as itself and on its own plane. Hence it seems to follow that throughout the whole of this segment of its evolution, the ego cannot be considered as conscious, nor even as conscious, on its own plane, in any intelligible sense. Next, still confining our consideration to the ego in this same period of its evolution, let us consider the problem of its consciousness in the mind-body, the vehicle of the ego on the Rupa mental plane. The variety of stages needing to be distinguished is here greater, and for the sake of brevity we may deal in detail only with the ordinary average type of person, an intelligent specimen of the man in the street, in whom there is little activity of abstract thinking properly so called, but considerable activity, though not much spontaneity, of concrete thought. From what has been said of this type, it is obvious that on the lower mental plane apart from the physical body during life the ego is not self-conscious, and it may be questioned indeed whether the ego would be able to hold the self-consciousness which it has undoubtedly acquired in the physical body, when apart from the latter even in the astral world, and still less, of course, in the mental. For it has been stated that even a fairly advanced pupil in occultism requires to be taught by his master to form the Maya Virupa or functional body of the lower mental world, and to retain his clear self-consciousness when centered in it. And though from what has been written about the consciousness of an ordinary intelligent man on the astral plane, when out of the physical body during sleep, it would appear that he then possesses a certain degree or kind of self-consciousness, not unlike that of one immersed in a brown study or daydream, yet he has little or no consciousness of the objective astral world around him, and indeed seems not to be awake to its phenomena. And this certainly seems to imply that even on the astral plane, during physical life, his self-consciousness must be very dim and certainly different in many respects from the clear, active, definite self-consciousness which he enjoys when awake and functioning normally in the physical body. But the conclusions to which the foregoing would seem to point must, perhaps, to some extent be modified in the light of what has been said regarding the post-mortem consciousness of such a man as we are considering. From the descriptions given, it appears that when once he wakes up in the astral world after death, he is fully and vividly self-conscious and also aware of his objective surroundings, though his actual objective world is limited to the particular subplane of the astral upon which his consciousness is focused for the time being by the condition of the various layers into which the matter of his astral body has then become stratified. This state of things continues till the ego sheathed in the mind-body separates itself from the astral body, and then, after an interval of oblivion analogous to that following upon the death of the physical body, his consciousness again becomes active in the devachanic condition. In devachan, the consciousness clearly has present to it an objective world, although it is a world of its own creation, since the forms, scenery, etc., which the consciousness perceives in that condition are the creations of its own mental energies and activities, and not the actual objectivity of the mental plane as distinct from the action of the individual's own mind upon it. But how about self-consciousness in this condition? On this point I do not recall any specific information, nor do any of the descriptions which have been given, nor the instances observed, throw clear light upon the question. Personally, I incline to think that self-consciousness at any rate so far as deliberate self-introspection and conscious thought about oneself are concerned is in abeyance during the devachanic state in the vast majority of cases, the consciousness being wholly absorbed in the direct contemplation and blissful experience of the self-created objectivity with which the man's mind surrounds him. But I am by no means sure that this is the case. In any case, however, the decision on this point does not seem to me of vital significance in relation to the general conclusions to which the foregoing summary appears to point. These would seem to be as follows: 1. The ego during incarnation is, at the outset of its evolution, only self-conscious in and through the physical body, and it retains this self-consciousness after death only through its astral existence, since in the early stages of human progress the ego enjoys no devachan at all. CP. CWLS devachanic plane. 2. When the evolving ego has attained the level of the intelligent ordinary man, it is still only fully self-conscious in and through the physical body during life, but it has developed a dim and modified self-consciousness in the astral body during sleep. After death it is fully self-conscious during the astral life and, perhaps, dimly so during its period of rupa devachan. 3. In neither case, however, is the ego self-conscious upon, or even aware of, the objectivity of its own plane, the arupa mental, except during the momentary flash already spoken of. Passing on now to consider the ego in a still more advanced stage, say in one who has entered upon the path, we are told that such a man first becomes fully self-conscious and awake upon the astral plane during the sleep of the physical body, then learns to form the mind-body into the maya virupa, and to function self-consciously and fully awake to his objective surroundings on the lower mental plane, and, finally, to function in full self-consciousness in the causal body, having united the personality to the individuality, and thus aroused full and complete self-consciousness in the ego itself. But before this last stage is reached, we are told that the flash of self-consciousness in the ego, which occurs at the close of each devachanic period, has become prolonged, or drawn out progressively into an increasing span of clear self-conscious activity in the ego, which is spoken of as its arupa devachan. It seems, however, to be implied that this extension in time of the flash is not permanent, but sooner or later fades out and the ego sinks back into oblivious unconsciousness before, reversing their polarity, its energies are again poured forth into the denser planes on the way to rebirth. but it seems implied that where once the personality has been merged in the individuality, and the waking self-consciousness of the living man, whether or no any memory thereof is impressed on the physical plane, has been united with and established in the causal body, the ego has then at last attained to permanent, elapsing, indestructible self-consciousness on its own plane and in relation to the objectivity of its own world, the upper levels of the mental plane. Taking now what has been said in connection with the general teaching regarding the ego's evolution and its relation to the various sheaths or vehicles, we may, perhaps, summarize its bearing as follows. 1. The development of self-consciousness in the ego is gradual. 2. It begins in connection with the physical body, and is at first only maintained so long as that physical body is actively awake. 3. It is gradually established also in the astral body, when separated from the physical, and similarly in relation to the mind body and the causal body. 4. Self-consciousness seems to demand a lens, a something which shall concentrate and focus, as it were, the potential rays of consciousness into a center in which the ego can become aware of itself. 5. This focus can exist at any rate until the ego becomes fully self-conscious on its own plane only in one vehicle or body at a time. However rapidly, in the developed man, the focus may change from one body to another. 6. In the absence of such a focus as appears in the case of an undeveloped and ill-organized vehicle, self-consciousness lapses, either entirely or partially. 7. In the case of the ego which has attained full self-consciousness on its own plane, we have not as yet any definite information regarding its condition qua self-consciousness while it is actively functioning through the waking physical body. It seems, however, probable that as the focus of its attention and activity is then centered in the physical body, it is comparatively inattentive to, and therefore unaware of, the objectivity of its own, or intermediate planes, except in so far as these can be reflected into the physical brain. And now, after these lengthy preliminary considerations, we may turn to the questions propounded. The passing of consciousness inwards from one sheath to another, taking the case of the developed man on the path, as the most illustrative, implies the shifting of the focus of self-consciousness from one body to another. Now, if the connecting links of etheric matter between, say, the dense physical and the astral bodies are well developed and functional, this passage will take place not only gradually, but the focus itself will be maintained clear and well defined at each step or stage of the process, and hence there will be no blank, no sinking into unconsciousness as the focus passes from one body to the other either way. The whole process will be continuous and unbroken by any sudden jumps or leaps across imperfect or missing rungs in the ladder of ascent, but if these etheric links are imperfect, impermeable, or functioning badly, such leaps or jumps will certainly occur, and at each the focus of self-consciousness will be disturbed, or it may be lost altogether, and a momentary lapse of self-consciousness, either wholly or partially, will result, and further from the standpoint of the backward-looking memory there will be a blank, there will be nothing remembered to give a content to such moments when the focus leaps across a gap, or is disturbed in passing through an imperfect link. So much for the living man who has reached the stage of functioning self-consciously and awake on planes higher than the physical. And the same explanation will obviously apply even more forcibly to the post-mortem passage of the focus of self-consciousness from the physical to the astral, and from the astral to the devachanic. As regards the last part of the question, the answer to it is contained in what has already been said. The ego is certainly not self-conscious always on some plane or other, as we have seen. On the contrary, it is only at a comparatively advanced stage of evolution that the ego becomes permanently self-conscious on its own plane, while, as we have seen, according to its stage of growth, the ego may be self-conscious only on the physical plane during life and on the astral after death, or its self-consciousness may extend to the devachanic later on, and gradually expand from a momentary flash to a more or less prolonged period of self-consciousness of the ego itself. After the Rupa Devacha is over,